So in the absence of Ina, just to stay on schedule. So our next speaker is Keenan Reesor from Southern Virginia University, and you'll be presenting Fragments of a Musical Style, Rachmaninoff's music of late 1917. Feel free to share your screen and continue.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to begin by extending my thanks to the organizers of the conference and to the other presenters. It's been a pleasure to tune in for those that I've been able to in my time zone, and it's an honor to be in your company and to share my research with you presently. Okay, sorry for my crazy hair. I'd like to just give a brief preface to my paper, which is that the topic I've chosen pertains to his output and his reception in a kind of a particular way. And so I'll take a few minutes at the beginning to establish a rather broad context for the relatively small number of pieces that we'll look at. So I guess just be ready for that. The liberalization of Western musicology in recent decades has yet to yield a reassessment of Rachmaninoff's oeuvre in cultural terms. Despite their increasing inclusion of non-classical genres and traditionally marginalized musicians, Western music histories remain somewhat dogmatic in their adherence to a modernistic interpretation of early 20th century classical music. Progressive composers, quote, always have an edge in the history books. Even in this one, Richard Tereskin wrote in his Oxford History of Western Music. Because historiography, if it is to be interesting, has to give preference to change over stasis, close quote. This paradigm, no matter how benignly applied, inevitably renders Rachmaninoff a musical conservative, behind the time, and thus irrelevant to it. It is, of course, true that Rachmaninoff departed less from compositional norms than his modernistic contemporaries, and it is also true that the fact of his having lived does not make him emblematic of his time. In life, however, he belonged very much to his time, as much in his early automobile ownership as in the permanent loss of his homeland to war and revolution. And those who care to look will find the woes of emigration richly inscribed in his music from 1918 to his death in 1943. A socially inflected historical assessment might authenticate his music on this basis, in spite of its comparative conservatism. Reception history might also show that his reputation as a conservative coalesced during the same period in direct proportion to the mounting popularity of works that he had composed many years before. As an evocation of modern life, the music that Rachmaninoff composed in emigration thus figures significantly into his historical assessment. But emigration was only one factor in its stylistic development. Rachmaninoff's later style was born in the crucible of a sequence of hardships that wrought a change in his worldview between 1913 and 1917. Death and illness in his circles heightened his sense of mortality. Fears of compositional stagnation precipitated a professional identity crisis, and compounding societal chaos upset the foundations of his life and art. Amply documented in reminiscences and letters, Rachmaninoff's anxieties also manifested themselves in his music. While his two large works of 1913, the Bells and the Piano Sonata No. 2, both adhere to a philosophy of romantic transcendence, his Opus 38 songs and Opus 39 Etude Tableau exhibit symbolist features, and what he composed in emigration occasionally suggests disillusionment. This evolution in the musical evocation of Rachmaninoff's changing worldview revealed itself with poignant clarity in music that he wrote in late 1917 to the accompaniment of revolutionary gunfire. His revisions to the Piano Concerto No. 1 and 3 enigmatic and rarely performed piano pieces, of which only one was published during his lifetime. Routinely overlooked for their brevity and befuddling affective diversity, the solo pieces in fact show Rachmaninoff in a state of stylistic crisis. Fragments, as one of them is called, recalls the nostalgic euphony for which he grew famous. An untitled piece in D minor represents his last puff of musical symbolism. An Oriental sketch points toward his style in emigration in its taut coolness. The scholarly ethic of today eschews the posthumous biographical interpretation of music, but in Rachmaninoff's case, hermeneutical analysis of this sort rests on the solid foundation of his own testimony. To him, life and composition were inseparable. A composer's music, he wrote in 1941, should be the product of the sum total of a composer's experiences. What I try to do when writing down my music is to make it say simply and directly that which is in my heart." Close quote. He was also the first to suggest that emigration had changed the significance of his music. "Certainly I still write music," he told the London Daily Telegraph in 1933, "but it does not mean the same thing to me now." The hardships that Rachmaninoff endured between 1913 and 1917 could fill an entire report of their own. In fact, they did for me last summer. They are depressing even to list, but I'm going to do just that. First, a string of 4 deaths heightened his sense of mortality. In December 1913, the French pianist Raoul Pugnot had arrived in Moscow to begin a tour, but fell ill and asked Rachmaninoff to substitute for him on short notice. Rachmaninoff refused. Pugnot died 12 days later, and the composer grew terrified that a similar fate might overtake him on his own tours. In 1915, his old friend Alexander Scriabin and his mentor Sergei Taneyev died one after the other, and he developed a terrible fear of death. Lastly, his father died 1 year later in 1916, just days before what was to be their first meeting in years. At the same time, ultramodernism, as it was then termed, was making gains, and Rachmaninoff was coming under fire in Russia for not keeping pace with Scriabin. In 1914, he failed to produce a major opus for the first time in years. And though in early 1915 he scored a success outside the domain of concert music with his All-Night Vigil, he then failed to produce another major opus until late 1916, when he composed his Opus 38 6 poems and Opus 39 9 Etude tableaux. Shortly thereafter, political instability forestalled composition until the end of 1917. In 4 years, he had produced only 3 opuses in just 2 bouts of successful work. Racked with self-doubt, he contemplated abandoning composition altogether. Finally, the onset of World War I interrupted his foreign touring schedule and initiated Imperial Russia's fatal descent into the revolutions of 1917, all of which served to darken his outlook. As domestic conditions worsened in 1917, his work eventually ground to a halt. He lost his country estate to the peasantry, tried in vain to leave the country, and retreated to his Moscow apartment as the Bolshevik Revolution swept the city. Then lost his savings to the fledgling government. An unexpected invitation to perform in Sweden provided a sudden way out, which he took, realizing that he may never return. And of course he did not. The general musical consequence of these tribulations can be felt, broadly speaking, by comparing any major work composed before this period to any of his major works composed after it. For example, After hearing Rachmaninoff perform his new Corelli variations in 1932, Sergei Prokofiev declared, "This is not the old Rachmaninoff of the second and third concertos." Indeed, even a momentary juxtaposition of the variations with the second concerto is instructive. Both works begin in the minor mode, trace a long dramatic arc, and showcase Rachmaninoff's lyrical and virtuosic piano writing, but their conclusions could hardly differ more. The concerto employs an emphatic, protracted, dominant pedal point to introduce a transcendently majestic and lyrical theme that drives the work to its triumphant close. And if you'll humor me, we probably all know this work, but I'm going to just play a few seconds of it anyway. Okay, here is just a snippet of the end of that work. And so on. The variations, by contrast, not only refrain from transcendent thematic transformation, they increase in anger and disillusionment, grotesquely contorting their noble theme with non-functional chromaticism and violent registral displacements before ending on a decidedly dejected note. Here's a sample of that. And so on. Rachmaninoff's stylistic evolution can be traced against this backdrop. His Sonata No. 2 in B-flat minor, which he composed in 1913, that's the beginning of the period under consideration, is in many respects the old Rachmaninoff. Much like the second and third concertos, the sonata dramatizes a minor mode, major mode struggle in the fashion of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony and ends with a big tune. The harmonic language is at times more densely chromatic, but the concept is fundamentally the same. Here's a snippet of the lead up and the beginning of the big tune in the second sonata. And so on. A shocking change of tone came in the song from the Gospel of St. John, which Rachmaninoff composed in early 1915 for an anthology to be published for war relief. So recall that by early 1915, he's already suffered a death. There's been the general mobilization in Russia for World War I, and his daughter has also had the scarlet fever. He's had this compositional dry spell. So lots happened in the space of 1 year. And this piece is really unusual. It's quizzically short, just over a minute long. It sets the text to John chapter 15, verse 13 from the New Testament, which reads, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." The song sets this text imperiously, with angular flourishes and densely chromatic, if functional, harmonies. It has the distinction of being Rachmaninoff's only work that I know of not to end with a tonic chord, ending instead on an inverted submediant. Here's a sample from that. There you have it. It ends on a 6/6. Rachmaninoff's Opus 38 songs and Opus 39 Étude Tableau, both composed in 1916, represent a rather different but equally significant departure from Rachmaninoff's earlier style. He composed them after an intense spell of self-doubt that abated after his friend Marietta Shigenian, herself a minor symbolist poet, recommended several symbolist texts to him for composition. Again, a lot more has transpired in this time than we can really take note of, but this would include Scriabin and Taneev's deaths. It would include Rachmaninoff's tour of his All Scriabin tour and the critical backlash that came from that. So again, he's gone through a lot in the space of a year. As Rachmaninoff had hitherto maintained a consistent aversion to literary symbolism in his songs, his acute emotional vulnerability resulting from converging hardships apparently opened him to its influence, if only temporarily. 4 of the 6 songs from Opus 38 deal with sadness, isolation, and separation. The song To Her, Kényi, Opus 38 number 2, is emblematic of the more chromatic harmonic language that Rachmaninoff employed in these 2 opuses. The song is functionally tonal, but infuses some of its harmonies with symmetrical scales, and thus employs deeper chromaticism even than what we just heard in the Gospel of St. John. In one such instance, Rachmaninoff employs the octatonic scale to evoke lamentation, and of course, he most likely gained exposure to that by playing Scriabin's music. So I realize I'm playing a lot of excerpts, but I'm trying to just take you along through his stylistic evolution here in this period. So here's a snippet of Kényi, which will feature the octatonic scale under the text Gdzie Milaya. This song, I should mention, the text portrays a lover who has died and is standing in the river Lethe and calls out to his lover, who he doesn't know where she is, and he says, "Come and join me in the streams of the Lethe." That's the river in Hades that washes everyone from their memories. So it's quite an upsetting symbolist poem. Here's an excerpt from the setting. And so on. These are sounds you won't often hear in Rachmaninoff's oeuvre. This is just Opus 38 and 39 in a couple of places. Finally, Rachmaninoff's music of late 1917, the actual subject of my paper, the part we're getting to, reveals the composer in crisis, stylistically, no less than personally. Confined to his apartment by revolutionary unrest, he first undertook his long-awaited revision of his first concerto, which he had composed way back in 1891 as a 17 and 18-year-old. He did this, as he said, to the accompaniment of, quote, machine guns and rifle shots. an experience that could drive the idealism out of most anyone, I imagine. And indeed, while his many revisions to the work all attest to his considerably greater skill as a composer, one change looms above the rest in philosophical import. He cut its big tune. Like the Grieg concerto, on which it was apparently modeled, the final movement of Rachmaninoff's first concerto originally ended with a majestic recapitulation of its lyrical central subject. But in the revised version, Rachmaninoff transformed this same subject into a coda of blazing energy. Never again, in fact, would he conclude a multi-movement concert work with the kind of upward, surging, majestic tune that has so endeared him to the concert-going public. The Sonata No. 2 ended up being the last one, and I'm happy to quibble over the fourth concerto if anyone wants to, but that's my opinion. So here is the original culmination of the last movement of the first concerto. This is the original version. And now the revised version. It's going to sound quite different. He really changed the structure of the end completely. All right. And so on. Triumphant, yes, but not transcendent. Further, in the final movement, he twice embellishes a structurally normal half cadence with a tertian but non-functional chord progression. So any of you who are familiar with this concerto, this is a really unusual passage. In this section, he has ascending dominant seventh chords in the left hand in a rhythmically disjunct pattern, and then he's outlining chromatic sevenths and ninths spread out over an octave for those in the right hand. So it's actually dominant seventh and or minor ninth chords consecutively, but the hands converge, so it creates quite a bustle of movement, very strident. Here's that. It's very fast. Coming up. Right there. So you won't hear that in the original version either. And you won't hear it in much of any music before, about 1900 anyway. This little feature, this little cadential progression here is actually very significant for Rachmaninoff's stylistic evolution. He wasn't using that kind of non-functional harmony until 1916, and it was in his symbolist opuses where that kind of chromaticism was placed at the service of a very different kind of effect. Here, these harmonies acquire a newly strident quality that is anomalous, if at all present in his earlier music, but became common during his émigré period. Though fleeting, the passage clearly anticipates the stridency heard earlier in his Corelli variations. Both philosophically and affectively, and technically, then, the revised first concerto strongly anticipates the composer's works in emigration. But consolidating earlier gains isn't the same as forging a new path. In 3 unusual pieces that he composed just days after completing the concerto, and just days before receiving the performing invitation that allowed him to leave the country, show the composer in a state of stylistic disorientation. This all happened really fast. He dated his manuscript of the revised first concerto November 10th. And then November 14th, he's already dated 2 of these short pieces, and November 15th, he dates a 3rd one. So he finishes 3 short pieces in just a few days. And it's within just days after that that he received this invitation to leave. So he composed these pieces in a very small window where he really didn't know what to do musically, and he didn't know how, if at all, he was going to get out of Russia. It's a really unique window where he was really just kind of holed in his apartment. Working in a state of de facto house arrest, Rachmaninoff composed 3 fleeting pieces in contrasting characters whose lack of any real harmonic trajectory similarly confines them to the modest space of an incipient ternary form lasting 2 minutes or less in performance. So 3 pieces essentially trapped just like their composer when he wrote them. One of them, let's see here. One of them, enigmatically titled Fragments, a lyrical sketch in A-flat major, revisits the nostalgic vein of some of his preludes, albeit with an unyieldingly austere 4-part texture rarely witnessed in his oeuvre. Like much of his earlier music, Fragments features a characteristic selection of standard chromatic chords produced through modal borrowing and enharmony. But whereas in so much of his earlier music, such harmonies impel the music forward, here they tend to regress. The theme of the outer sections begins with the tonic chord, that's A-flat major, but repeatedly slips toward the mediant, the most distant diatonic chord from the tonic, and cadences through a weakly voiced supertonic 7th chord. Here's the brief A section of Fragments. Its center section consists of a sequential bridge, traditionally very strong territory for Rachmaninoff. Again, the effect is flaccid. In Rachmaninoff's character pieces, sequences most often rise toward a climax or otherwise expand in texture toward registral peaks. To recall a piece just mentioned, a bridge in the 2nd movement of his Piano Sonata No. 2 features just such an expansion in a lyrical setting. And out of time, I won't play that example. Here, however, the sequence droops depressingly lower twice before forcing an enharmonic retransition to the opening theme. Here's the bridge passage. And so on. A second piece, which is in D minor but bears no title, recalls Rachmaninoff's recent symbolist style and imparts a particularly morbid Scriabinesque tone. Like opuses 38 and 39, it features chromaticism not only of the more superficial sort, but also utilizes symmetrical scales and even some non-functional progressions. Further, it seamlessly modulates between functional and non-functional harmony, much like Scriabin. In its opening phrase, for example, traces multiple chromatic passing tones over a static D minor chord, so basically functional chromaticism, then pivots to a symmetrical scale, which is a 10-note scale that's Messiaen's 7th mode of limited transposition for 2 measures, then concludes with 2 measures built on the D melodic minor scale. So he's using all sorts of materials in just 6 measures. Here's the beginning of that piece in D minor, where you can hear those 6 measures. And so on. Almost done here. The central section employs tertian harmonies non-functionally in a manner that might best be interpreted as a pitch class set. It really doesn't follow any norms of traditional harmony. Before pivoting seamlessly back to D minor for a cadence, and I'm going to omit that example in the interest of time. The third and last piece of this trio is a motoric piece in B-flat major that he eventually published under the title Oriental Sketch. In its perpetual motion, it certainly exudes energy, but like its 2 siblings, it ultimately lacks any concrete harmonic trajectory. All but 2 of its measures feature a B-flat pedal point. That's the entire piece, B-flat major pedal point, except for 2 measures. Within these parameters, Rachmaninoff creates interest through mode mixture, some chromatic movement in the inner voices, and a brief sequence leading to a bridge. But the piece imparts a strangely static impression in contrast to its incessant rhythmic energy. In its incessantly repeated figurations and brightly accented rhythmic groupings, particularly in Rachmaninoff's own recording, the piece does, however, evoke an emotional coolness that looks ahead to his émigré period. In this respect, Oriental Sketch is the most original of the 3 pieces. And here's a brief example from Rachmaninoff's own recording. And then I'll wrap up. And then a little bit of the bridge, so you can hear. I mean, this is the really only it's the only harmonic departure in the entire piece, and it's pretty modest. And so on, and he comes right back. After Rachmaninoff left Russia, he completed not a single original composition for over 8 years, the longest hiatus of his career. During that time, he did, however, begin producing brilliant piano transcriptions, and his earliest effort in this vein conclusively demonstrates the significant scope of his stylistic evolution during this period just surveyed. I'm referring to his snarky cadenza to Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, recorded in 1919. Here, as in his revised first concerto, Rachmaninoff employs non-functional chords to strident effect, but he goes further still, using these chords to grotesquely exaggerate Liszt's thematic material in what amounts to an act of parody. And that, like the Corelli variations, is decidedly not the old Rachmaninoff. Here's a snippet of that cadenza. And so on. In conclusion, the historiography of 20th century music may give priority to change over stasis. But as Tereskin also noted, the stasis was only relative. Even within recognizably old styles, there was room for freshness and originality as long as imaginative composers were drawn to them, close quote. By infusing functional tonality with such modern affective traits as disillusionment and sarcasm, Rachmaninoff's music in Emigration shows this statement to be true. Even though it would still take him more than a decade to synthesize these new traits in the creation of cohesive original works, they were all there. All the traits were there once he left Russia. They emerged during a period of intense personal and artistic struggle between 1913 and 17 as he responded musically to the enormous challenges that he encountered in midlife. And this confluence of his life and music laid the foundation for the hermeneutical interpretation of his émigré works as an evocation of contemporary experience, divorcing the question of his stylistic contemporaneity from the question of his musical authenticity. Thank you. Thank you all for your patience. I'm sure I had some Wi-Fi problems at some point, but thanks for listening. And I'm happy to field any questions if anyone has them or comments. Any other Rachmaninoff people out there?
I have one question. So I don't study Rachmaninoff, but I found your kind of almost like semiotic deconstruction of his music. I was wondering how you were thinking about what inspired so you talked about the kind of inspiration of this development of a style up until kind of the time when he leaves Russia officially. Do you see kind of carryovers? Can you kind of track a chronological or kind of like an imbricated kind of style that leads up to his kind of total let's say aesthetic rebirth? Can you see these particular essences and kind of track them back to very key moments, almost in a kind of a quasi-chronological working?
Yes, thank you, John. That was in fact my objective in sharing so many samples along the way, because he composed very little, or I should say comparatively little, during these 4 years, and each opus presented something unusual, some kind of departure from his style up to 1913. And so that's where I was trying to make the point about the first concerto, that when he employed non-functional chromaticism in a strident way, he was capitalizing on an extension of his musical language developed for the symbolist opuses, but employing it for different means. So there is increase in the chromaticism of his language across the time period, but then a sudden departure largely from the euphony of his earlier music after the time of his emigration. So, we're not talking about a big break like we get between Stravinsky's, Rite of Spring and, the works of the 1920s. We're talking about a little bit more of a finessed evolution, but then that's why I tried to go over it in detail to try to impart, some appreciation of that.
Good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.